IVM.
The Inheritors Podcast Series by Bloomberg Quint.
Welcome to The Inheritors, a podcast series that talks of all aspects of family businesses. I am Sonu Bhasin, and today I am in conversation with Sunjay Kapur, the CEO and head of the Sona Group. The Sona Group is one of the largest manufacturers of components for the automotive industry, not only in India, but across the world. Besides heading this group, Sunjay is also an avid polo player and brings a lot of the learnings from polo into the business and his management style. But as he says, it could just be the reverse. Today, as he talks to us, he takes us through the genesis of the Sona Group, which started off as Sona Steering, and how over the years his father actually groomed him to take his place one day. Over to Sunjay.
Yeah, Sunjay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And good of you to take time out and speak to the listeners about your journey and your business. So let's get started from your early childhood. When was it that you realized that you were part of a family business?
So my early childhood began in Mumbai. My father came back in the early 70s from the US. He was finishing his PhD when I was born. I was born there. And then we came back to Mumbai. He had married my mother, who was from a business family. And he was from a family of jewelers. However, he had studied mechanical engineering, and he wanted to do something with that sort of in that field. And his father-in-law had an idea of setting up a gear business for the automotive component industry, and he set up a company called Bharat Gears, back in the I'd say mid 70s, and it was set up in Thane, and we lived in Mumbai and Bombay then, and almost every weekend we'd go to the factory. The factory was very in the old traditional style, had a guest house and had a big well with fish in the well and little dogs all around. So it was very sort of old world sort of factories the way they were. It was a large piece of land, had a lot of sort of green area, etc. So we were three kids, my two sisters and I, and we'd sort of get into the car on the weekends and we'd drive to the factory and we'd spend all of Saturday there pretty much. My father was working, and we'd be sort of running around that little guest house area, etc. So that's really when we got introduced to the factory work, a factory environment, and that continued for a long period of time. I of course went to day school in Bombay, and both my sisters and I went to Cathedral when we were young, and then we all went off to boarding school. I went to Doon, and my sisters went to Wellams. From there, I started studying German as a second language.
That was in school?
In Doon School. And I was sitting my ICSE exams, and I was doing German as a language.
So German was instead of Sanskrit?
Instead of Hindi.
Instead of Hindi?
Yes. I had a US passport, so I had the option. My father was doing a lot of work with Germany. So we got exposed to Germany because he was actually working with a company called ZF, where we were supplying gears to Germany. And he was doing a lot of great stuff because the Indian economy itself was very, very small. Not many companies were interested in looking at the Indian economy at that point in time in terms of bringing technology or bringing companies into India. However, he was exporting to Germany, which was a big achievement.
This was in the 70s?
It was in the 70s. He was exporting to Germany. And I remember going with him to Fendt tractors in Friedrichshafen, to ZF in Friedrichshafen, visiting. We'd go on a lot of business trips with him because he'd take the whole family and we'd sort of, hang around. And he would then invite people over to our home in Bombay. And it was quite interesting because I was always made to make a welcome speech to whoever came.
In German?
In English.
In English at that time.
And my sisters would do a little Bharatanatyam performance. So it was all like a little family sort of skit we'd put together. We had the mayor of Friedrichshafen once come to our home. And Friedrichshafen, because Fendt tractors was there, and we were supplying to Fendt. And then ZF, Zanderfabrik, which is ZF, was also there. So we were exposed to that whole sort of, culture. Coming back to why I said, why I made the point about learning German was also because then when I was 14, I went to BMW to work. So I was
You must have been in school at
Yeah,
that
I was
time.
in school.
So this was during holidays.
During the summertime, my father... So interestingly, so let me go back a little bit. He ran Bharat Gears for a while.
Was it his company or did he run it?
So it was his father-in-law's company. So it was my grandfather's company. And he ran the business, he set the business up, he ran it, etc. And then in the late 80s, he decided he wanted to do something on his own, which he wanted to own, as opposed to owned by the family. So that's when the idea of Sona came around. That's when the idea of, the steering business came around. But before that, just prior to that, in the late 80s, again, he had an agency for BMW. So he was to sell cars. So he was one of the first people to get the agency for BMW in India.
In Bombay?
In Delhi, at that time.
I see. So what prompted the move from Bombay to Delhi?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One was, he was originally from Delhi. Two, he wanted to set up something with his brothers at that time. One of his brothers was, in the fabric business, and one of them was in jewelry, and the other was in jewelry, but outside of India. Three, of course, I think the driving force was that he wanted to do something with Maruti. And Maruti setting up in Gurgaon, etc., was prompted, the move to Delhi. We had a base in Delhi, so it was also an easy sort of decision for him to make. Going back to, just to complete the BMW part of it, again, I was, because of his association with BMW, I had the opportunity to work on the shop floor for about, 4 weeks during the summer. More of a German learning experience than anything else, but it was a great experience for me because, I was a little kid and I was given these overalls and, given a map of subway station. I was living with an employee of the head office. I think someone who worked in probably the CEO or one of the senior people's offices, and I was living on their couch and getting up every morning and Monday to Friday going to the factory and sort of learning the ropes. It was a very interesting experience for me, and that was when I really got a feeling of shop floor. Whilst when we were kids, we were fascinated by the forklift and by all that other stuff and the tractors, etc. in the factory. We never really got an experience of the shop floor as such, but this was really my first time experience on the shop floor. And then sort of coming back to him moving to Delhi in the late 80s, Maruti had an opportunity where they were looking for a steering maker. So my father decided that he'd go out and get the technology from JTech, which was then called Koyo Seiko, part of the Koyo Bearing, Koyo Seiko Group. And he went out and I think he visited Japan almost every month for almost 6 or 8 months before they signed a joint venture agreement with them, because they had some bad experience in India, with regard to one of their partners paying them royalty, etc. So he spent, every month spent time there, just sort of convincing them that he was the right partner for them and that they should enter India. And the steering business was, required by Maruti at that time. And, again, the market was so small. However, he saw an opportunity, and he was a true entrepreneur where, he saw a risk that he wanted to sort of mitigate. So that's how he set up Sona Steering.
And the name Sona, I'm told, is because of your family business of jewelry.
Yeah, so the name Sona for him was associated with trust, because jewelry at that point was never sold with a certificate, but was sold on trust. And Sona meaning gold in Hindi, etc. So that whole association of gold and jewelry and Sona was associated with trust. For him, reputation, integrity, trust, things like these were really key, to any success that he sort of saw in business.
So as part of growing up, you pretty much did go visit the factory. You were clear that you were part of a business family. When were those first seedlings that started taking sprout in your mind that you may also want to come back once you finish studies? and join the family business?
So while I was in school, I also did a stint, I took a semester off and did a stint at a steering factory, which was owned by Koyo at JTech, which is called Koyo then, and TRW. It was a joint venture. Traditionally, TRW, Koyo, NSK, all these were competitors. However, in the US, they had a plant in Warner, Tennessee, called TRW Steering, TRW Koyo Steering.
And Koyo is a Japanese company.
Koyo is Japanese, which we had a collaboration with
Sona
Koyo, first Sona Koyo, which is now called JTech, of course. So I worked on the shop floor when they first came out with the concept of tool crib, which was a Kanban concept, which was really replacing the right tools at the right time on the shop floor so that you don't waste time in production. So I was introduced to that concept, and I must have been in my early 20s, probably just about 20, 21, around that age. Took a semester of school from college, and then went and worked there. And that's when I got another real introduction into what the Japanese systems were, etc. And that then gave me sort of the feeling that I wanted to go back and work in the business.
So you've actually, as part of growing up, on one side you were part of a family that ran businesses and then set up a business, and two, you were also exposed to the Japanese. And Japanese are very, very strong on culture, and they have some of the longest, the family businesses that have lasted many, many generations. 82 generations, I think, is the oldest one. What were some of the, similarities that you found working in a, where culture takes primacy, and two, any differences that you found in, the two different cultures?
So the Japanese companies we worked with...
Koyo a family-owned business?
So Koyo, Mitsubishi, these are the two large companies we joint ventured with, was not a family business. Somik, on the other hand, which we joint ventured with, was family business. I'd say the Japanese culture came into Indian business, especially the automotive industry, because of Maruti. The Japanese culture is very sort of process-driven, very sort of systematic, and it's just very quality-driven also. And these are the things that we adapted with from the Japanese, more than the family business culture per se. It was more the culture of quality, the culture of following the system, following the process, and building up businesses around that. I think the improvements that Japanese businesses make, the kaizens, which are incremental improvements, or the breakthroughs, etc., are great learnings for us, and have been great learnings for us across the automotive industry. I would actually credit the entire automotive industry to, the joint ventures that we did with the Japanese, and or majority of us did these joint ventures, really to learn technology and to learn processes and to learn, design. And today we are able to, compete globally because of what we learned from the Japanese, from that perspective. Again, Sona Koyo, was a joint venture which was set up initially for Maruti, and then across, different customer bases. We supplied to, again, Koyo is also owned by Toyota, partly. It's now, of course, called JTech, because they absorbed Toyota's steering division as well as the machinery division. So JTech became a large, company which was Toyota owned, and therefore we supplied to Toyota, we supplied to Mahindra, we supplied to Maruti Suzuki, to Hyundai, to across the board in the passenger car business.
So Japanese culture on one side, and then the German culture on the other. Again, any differences that you see, any similarities that you see, or anything that you then adapted for the Indian culture, because you couldn't transplant that, obviously.
So when it comes to Germany, we have acquired a business there. In 2008, we made an acquisition of ThyssenKrupp's forging division, and we acquired the entire forging division of ThyssenKrupp, which made us, combined with our Indian entity, the world's largest gear manufacturers for differential gears, and supplies across passenger car, commercial vehicles, off-highway vehicles, as well as farm equipment. From the German perspective, I would say most of the culture that we've adopted is from the Japanese, especially for our Indian businesses. So when we look at quality, when we look at visual displays, when we look at, our line setup, our, assembly lines, everything we look at is very, very oriented towards Japanese. If you look at uniforms, it's all very Japanese. The German culture is different, there's a lot of hierarchy in Germany, contrary to what people may assume or believe, There's a lot of emphasis on the owner in Germany as opposed to, even India or Japan. Absolutely. Working in Germany is very, very different from working in India. It's very it's not as flexible, I'd say. It's a very protective environment.
And is it hierarchical as well?
Very hierarchical, very much so. It's not easy to scale down. And I always say this, whilst people look at other countries that are looking at protectionism, etc. I said Germany is as protected as any other country because it's not easy to sort of scale down when you need to. The social costs are extremely high. So it's a different experience. So I would say in India we've adopted mostly the Japanese culture.
So you're talking about systems, you're talking about processes, and then you're talking of hierarchy. But business is ultimately about people. So now you've had an exposure to the German culture, deep exposure to Japanese culture, and you've grown up in the Indian culture. Just talk a bit about how people are seen, treated across these cultures.
Yeah, so like I said,
And then your own philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, look, people are the most important, part of business, especially today. Earlier on we used to look at it from an IT perspective where they said by 5 o'clock all our assets leave the office. However, that is across the board in every industry today. Today, I think the biggest thing the biggest challenge we have is talent acquisition and retention of good people. I've enjoyed working with Indian people the most, and that's why most of our expansion is, focused around India.
And why?
I'd say because, the culture of working here in terms of, the ability to continuously learn, the ability to continuously adapt to the changing environment and then, transform ourselves for that environment is great here in India. I would say with the Japanese, we've learned a lot. They're very, very system driven, very process driven, and they're very set in their ways, which has allowed them to succeed in a lot of fields. The Germans, I think, it's very difficult to change mindsets there. They're also very set in their ways. We've seen a lot of sort of successful companies come out of Germany. However, with all the change that's going on, all the disruption that's going on, it's also difficult when you've got a big ship to sort of change mindsets, etc. And I feel from that perspective, India is a lot easier to change mindsets. Again, because Indians in general are very entrepreneurial in nature. That's just been my experience from the 3 countries that we've discussed.
So to go back to your young adulthood, now that you look back, how did your father prepare you to join the business?
So what my father did was, a couple of things he did, which I, really sort of value was he allowed me to become an entrepreneur. So in that I set up 2 different businesses. My first business I set up was in the engineering outsourcing space. And again, I set that up because there was a requirement in a manufacturing company which we worked with, which was based in Liechtenstein, a company called Krupp Presta. And they made components for us. And I realized that there was a lot of data that they had in the form of 2D drawings. And at that point, we had been introduced to 3D software. And I asked them if I could really convert that data from 2D into 3D. Because I knew that they didn't have the manpower available or at the right price, manpower at the right price also available to convert 2D into 3D. So what I did was I actually took their 2D drawings, put a couple of guys in a hotel room in the same town, and I made them, in Liechtenstein. They were in a small town called Essen, which is a little outside of Vaduz. And I made these guys sit in a hotel room, gave them a software, which is a 3D software, and I said, let's convert these drawings from 2D to 3D and see how this process works. And slowly we started taking that data offshore. So it was a typical BPO sort of, except in the engineering space, BPO sort of business. And a lot of BPOs had been set up at that point. And I remember going...
And this was what, early 90s?
This was, this was in the...
Late 80s.
Late 90s. Around... no, it was...
So you would have
late 90s.
You would have finished your education by late 80s.
I'd finished my education. I'd come back. My first job I did was actually in the HR department in Sona Group.
I see. You worked in the...
I came back and I realized that in manufacturing in India there was a lot of focus on personnel, but nothing on HR. We also ran a business without any sort of clear strategy in mind. And it was a very different economy because, it was just about 1991, it was just about opening up, etc. Or it just opened up when I, came back. And I remember sitting through presentations that my father made to each and every employee in the boardroom, from the shop floor to the to middle and to top management, were invited into the boardroom in groups of 20, 30, 50, depending on the group, and the presentation was made in English and in Hindi, and he talked about, and I remember on those slide projectors where you literally had to sort of change sheets of paper.
Yeah, those.
And it was talked about the change that was coming in India and how we were going from a cost-plus economy to a competitive economy where we were going to face competition for the first time.
This was straight after 91.
This is right after, around that time. And that sort of, triggered my education in terms of strategy, HR, and I wanted to sort of learn a lot about that because I said, if we're going to go into a business where it's going to have competition, we should have a strategy in place on how we're going to fight this competition, where we're going to go with this business, how we're going to grow, and etc. So I studied strategy, I studied HR, etc. I came back, joined the HR department. I hired 3 other MBAs from Amity Business School. I remember going out there, recruiting them, and they were just not accepted in our system because we were engineering driven. No one had really hired MBAs, no one liked MBAs, and they were eventually pushed out of the system. But it was a great experience. I'm still in touch with with a couple of them, and we tried to sort of work to bring in performance appraisal, etc.
How difficult was it?
It was an uphill task. So I had a mentor called who's now called Dr. Bijlani.
Oh, Subhash.
Yes, yeah. So he came and helped me a lot, and I'm still in touch with him. In fact, I met him recently. He came and helped me in terms of setting up HR systems in the organization. And, we set up performance, we set everything up, but it was very, very difficult to get accepted.
And did that resistance come from the old-timers, or did it really come from the owners of the business, which is your dad and maybe your uncle?
It never came from my father. My father actually was very, very open to new systems, new ideas and making improvements. It came really from the old-timers in the company. It came not even from the top manager. It came from the second layer, And I, grew up in a very, in an environment where we were never really taught to be pushy or behave like owners' children, etc. I always sort of, called, everyone sir or Mr. So-and-so, etc. And I worked with them without sort of throwing my weight around, which resulted in us not being successful.
You thought you didn't push your weight around, I'm sure.
No,
if I were to ask them, they would have a different...
Well, if that were the case, we would have been successful. Well, the fact that we didn't succeed in terms of even holding on to these people...
But because that's passive aggression, right?
Probably. So, that was that part of it. And then During that time, I actually I met Pramod Bhasin, who had just set up with Raman Roy, the whole, G Capital, or whatever it was called at that time. And I looked at the call center and it was super exciting to see what they'd done. That's where I said, let me look at an engineering center. That's then going back to the Cook Presta, etc. I set this business up, had a little office in Okhla, moved out of, the Sona factory office and set this up, ran this. And as it grew, we moved back to Gurgaon because we needed more office space and we were growing rapidly. And then we started doing a lot of work for Sona as well. So whilst we were doing that, I then slowly took this business and merged it into one of our operating entities, as the R&D center, etc., for our operating company, and then slowly moved back into an operational role in our ball joint factory called Sona Somik Lemfoder, which was then a three-way joint venture between a German company, a Japanese company, and us.
That would have been fun if you had Germans and Japanese and Indians in the same boardroom.
So it was an interesting experience, but it was divided that way because the Japanese believed that the Germans would bring the German customers, Japanese brought the Japanese customers, and we'd bring the Indian customers. This business was really set up as a backward integration for our steering business. So it's a ball joint, which then makes the long gear, what is called the long gear in the steering gear. Connects the two, it connects the steering system to the wheels,
So one here and one there.
Well, here, yeah.
Okay.
In the ball joints and the wheels. And I was managing director of that business. I brought in a really good COO, and we put in a lot of quality systems. We really, really tried to improve the business, and we kept growing that business. We then came to a point where we were restructuring our businesses and we decided to exit the ball joint business because we figured that we had met our needs. Our needs at that time, when we set this business up, was there was no good ball joint manufacturer for the steering business.
For any brand, for any vehicle in India?
In India, there were no. So we were the largest steering system manufacturer for passenger car, and our choke point was the ball joint at that point. So we set this business. In fact, if you look at Rane, which is another competitor in the steering business, they also have their own ball joint facility. So we set this up because nobody could meet the quality standards and the delivery we required. We had achieved what we wanted to achieve, so we pulled out of this business. I then set up another entrepreneurial venture called Sixt, which was a car rental business. So I got the master franchise.
Car rental?
Yes. Sixt is a German company, which is now global, of course, and very, very strong in Europe, strong in Asia, now becoming stronger in the US and South America. And they're a family-run business, and they're in the car rental space. And we identified car rental as a good services business, and yet we had our roots, or our feet in the automotive business. So I set this business up. And it was super exciting because, it was a service business. It was very, very different from manufacturing. It required a lot of different sort of strategies. And we brought in Dr. Jagdish Sheth from
the marketing guy.
From Emory as our sort of, consultant. And I remember him telling us that you can either have be 100 shops in one city, or be one shop in 100 cities, and it's always better to be 100 shops in one city. And we went against everything he said, and we failed miserably. I'd say this is one of our big business failures. However, there was a lot of learning from that. That came out of that.
So what did you learn?
I think,
how did your dad react to it?
My father was sort of, again, was a very progressive thinker. His whole his only comment to me was, make a 7-point presentation of what you should not do in a business. That's it. It's a learning. We lost money. However, we should have learned something from it. And I want to say that there was a few things that really sort of brought us to this, or brought this failure about. One was, we were in a services business which was highly unorganized.
Which year was this?
2006.
As late as that?
Yeah. So it was 2000 and around
early 2000s.
Early 2000. I think we shut it in 2006 or 7. So it was between 2003, 2002, 2003, around there. What happened was, today if you look at that business, it would have been great because the Ubers of the world are here. The model is really an aggregator model.
But you own the assets.
We owned the assets. That was the problem. We ramped up to 400 assets, 400 cars in a span of a year. We went to every city possible. We went with clients like Jet Airways, IBM, Accenture, and they were like, we want you to be in every city. The most used vehicle was a Tata Indica. The cost of a driver and fuel is the same in a Tata Indica or in a Camry. It's just that the revenue you earn from the Tata Indica is nothing compared to what it is in a Camry. So we learned that, by burning our fingers. We didn't have the best experts on board. That was another, failure on our part. So I think it's good to have a mixture of people who are not from the industry and people who are well ingrained in the industry. We lacked that. We had alliances with large companies. I think we should have gone for more of a niche sort of alliance. We learned from Jagdish Sheth about, I'm forgetting the name of the company. It was, a company in the States, and how they had sort of grown, and how they had one type of vehicle and they provide one type of service. And I think we should have implemented a lot of those learnings. However, we, decided to go with what our customers said more than anything else. And again, we came from a very different industry, which was, driven by voice of customer in automotive and component manufacturing. We're very driven by voice of customer. And we went with this voice of customer, except here you're with a B2C business and we're coming from a B2B mindset. So very different mindset. One of the big mistakes we made was we sat in the same head office as, our manufacturing guys. So there was a lot of leaning on them and not really, taking those independent decisions and making small failures and then, improving on them. Again, when you have a business like this and you try and take it from an unorganized industry to an organized industry, it requires a different sort of game plan. We were competing with a small owner who had a family of a wife, husband, son, daughter, the in-laws, all running a business. The daughter-in-law would be maybe dispatching a car, the son would be taking a booking, and the mother would be sort of in charge of something. So, when you're running up against these kind of operators, it becomes very difficult when you're in a corporate environment trying to do events around, car rental. Whilst we took a lot of, the sixth philosophy, sixth is of self-drive company. And this is a purely chauffeur-driven company. Your brand ambassador becomes a chauffeur. I mean, I would sort of, take drivers on Sundays, make them sit in the back seat and drive them around to show them what kind of driving I wanted, when you should change your gear, etc., to have a smooth ride and all. And that worked when you had a few drivers, but as we expanded, it became very difficult to control that driver. The consumer of a service and the provider of a service have such a large education gap that, again, these things make a big difference. Today, the model probably works because it's an Uber model where, the driver owns his vehicle and he's responsible, he or she are responsible for generating their own revenue.
Largely he.
Largely he. And then again, all your cases of sexual harassment, etc. Not that we had any, but there was always that fear and that,
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now.
Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Did you also enjoy working in all of these businesses because they were somewhat your own, and while you were part of the overall umbrella, you were not really, this wasn't your dad's business. Sona was clearly your dad's business.
So I loved the business. For me, I loved service business. I remember when I first came back in the early 90s, to India, and I was like, I want to set up something like a Greyhound bus service. Mm-hmm. So this is almost like that idea, that I had sort of manifested in my mind and then in the universe, etc., was coming to life, where I wanted to do something with Greyhound buses and stuff. Because I saw Greyhound buses in the States and I saw them running, and I said, why can't we have this kind of a service in India? And why can't we service the common man more than, anything else, and going up and down? And I was never interested in getting into airlines, but I wanted to get into mass transport in this sort of way. So I think this was, something that was very exciting to me. And I would then try and compare it to how the airlines were executing their businesses, because that was the closest for us to say, okay, this is what Jet does, this is what Kingfisher at that time does, and there was no, Indigo at that point. And how do we replicate a service standard like this, etc.? Because again, the switching cost in a car rental business is nothing. One wrong pickup and the entire organization switches. So one wrong pickup in terms of, your driver didn't get to me when I had to get to a flight, and I missed my flight, and I missed my meeting, and there was no Google Maps at that time, and housing in Delhi is terrible in terms of, the numbering. There can be a B22 next to a C55, and you're like, okay, I have no idea where I'm going. And then when you're not in control and the driver's in control, you're always blaming the driver, and the driver does not know the roads, as per our expectations. And therefore today you have Google Maps, and so life is different. I think we were ahead of our times in this business, and yes, it was a big learning for us. I don't regret it at all.
And you did shut it down.
So what happened was, we then gave ownership to a South Indian company. So we had one of our vendors, what we call vendors, who was supplying cars to us. We sold him the business. The business was in losses, etc. But he paid us some consideration, and we sold him the business along with the franchise brand. He then, I think, sort of just eventually, closed the business down, because I know that the brand went back to Six. Because I met Six several times after that, because just from a point of view of, I've made a couple of investments in some startups which are related to this business and on that with that context. So I ran that 2006. So what happened in parallel to that was, I became the global chairman of EO, which is the Young Entrepreneurs Organization, which was formerly known as Young Entrepreneurs Organization. And that's something that I'd aspired to do, and I sort of became the global chairman of EO in 2007 was when I took over. But 2 years prior to that, I was sat on the global board, so I was chairman-elect, chairman-elect, and then chairman. And that consumed a lot of my time, in terms of travel, in terms of bandwidth, in running an organization which was, an organization of leaders. So it was, for me, it was, something that I wanted to do, something that I had sort of set my mind in terms of achieving, and when I was appointed chairman-elect, that sort of consumed a lot of my time. So I had a great bunch of generals but no soldiers, and we had a great sort of top team. In fact, one of the guys from that team I worked with all the way until a couple of years ago when I sold my stake in Sona Group. One of them I worked with and discontinued, and still working with on another project. So I've kept all those relationships, and they're a great bunch of guys. It's just, I think the time was wrong. And
so all of this, again, in retrospect, did it prepare you to take over the business one fine day when your dad had this unfortunate heart attack?
And I say this often.
And was there a succession plan in place, or you just had to take charge?
So, my father appointed me vice chairman of the business when Lalit Suri died. Lalit Suri is on our board and a very close friend of our families. In fact, his daughter Shraddha is still a very close friend of mine, and we're both in the automotive business, so we, meet more very often, even with regard to business. And so he was on our board and in Sona Group, and when he passed away very suddenly, I think a lot of family businesses started looking at succession planning. So I became vice chairman, at least in terms of designation. And then I think the preparation is a process. However, when you're thrown into the deep end, it's a completely different ballgame. So whilst so whilst a lot of these things sort of prepare. So and I tell you, I had a discussion very recently with another senior businessman who also has a large business and runs his business in the same fashion that we've talked about, ownership versus manager, etc. And he also gives his children the sort of encourages them to get into startups and stuff. And I was telling him, I said, the startup that I last ran failed. So did that make me more risk averse? So I can't really sort of pinpoint and say, because it failed, hey, am I going to start suddenly looking at everything like, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't do this because it can fail, etc. So I think, there are good and bad points to this. The good thing that...
but did it make you risk averse?
In some areas. In some areas I am sort of
so
more...
So you won't take a gambling risk, you take a calculated risk?
I take more calculated risks, I do. I would say that's, how we run. Of late, not, before we started doing these kind of acquisitions, etc., I'd say we were consistently boring. Boringly, it was, consistently boring. So, however, what really prepared me was in 2008 when my father bought the ThyssenKrupp business in Germany.
Which business, sorry?
The ThyssenKrupp forging division, which I talked about in Germany. We went into the downturn immediately, which forced him to move to Germany. And it forced me then to stop all my other ventures. And, Sixt was one of them, to then say, okay, let me get rid of Sixt to sell it to an entrepreneur who can then take it forward and move back to running Sona Group.
The core business.
The core business. And Sona Group at that point, for the first time in its history, had made a loss. And along with my team, I was able to sort of turn that around. We brought material cost in 2 years from 81% to 65% of sales. We did everything possible.
And the commodity price had nothing to do with it.
The commodity price had nothing. We just sort of cut a lot of sort of unwanted stuff. We improved yield. We brought a lot of processes in-house. We did a lot of stuff. My father and I both stopped taking salary for 2 years. We cut all management salaries by 18%. So we did a lot of stuff to turn the business. So I think running Sona Koyo from 2008 to 2015, when he suddenly passed away, really gave me the experience to be in the place that I am today, or be in the position I am today in terms of running the group. Again, no one teaches you what happens when a founder suddenly dies, and I see this more often than not. However, the experience that I had, because I was left alone to manage that business with a great bunch of professionals, don't get me wrong. I had a great CEO, great CTO who still works with me, the CTO, and he was in fact one of the founding members of Sona Group. So with my father, he joined my father right out of IIT in Bharat Gears and then Sona, and then he's still with me. He's been a great mentor, to us as a group, in terms of engineering and product development, etc., and manufacturing. I had a great bunch of people working with me, and we worked together, and I slowly started falling in love with the manufacturing business. So I'm not an engineer by training. I would say I'm an engineer today, because of everything that I do. However, for me it was always sort of, I'm not an engineer, and and I could see myself always looking at some entrepreneurial ventures, here and there. And then when I started sort of, getting into this and I was left alone to do this, I really started falling in love with manufacturing. And today, if you were to ask me if I see myself in anything other than manufacturing, I'd say no. And that's really what gave me the sort of, the experience, the confidence, the belief. I'm a very, very strong believer in the ability of my team, in the ability of ourselves to sort of, create success. So that's prepared me, I think.
So when you were left alone to run the business here in India, would you say that besides giving you that inherent confidence, it also gave the larger team an opportunity to judge you and examine you and score you as a leader?
Definitely. I mean, I would imagine that, I'm a very sort of team player sort of guy.
And that comes from polo?
I mean, I think polo comes because of that.
Polo.
Because I started polo very late in life, and I think that polo comes because of that. In fact...
Because polo is also about, a team, but each one doing their
polo
own thing.
Is the most, the game where you require the most amount of anticipation. You require anticipation, you require a lot of teamwork for polo. You can't do it on your own. And not only teamwork, you require work with horses. So you require, you've got
machines.
4 players. And
so you have people and you have machines and you need to get them to work together.
You really need to be in sync with each other. So when I sort of took over, I think the first thing that I did was I made a glass room from my room. It had wood, etc. I said, let's remove all the wood in this office. Mm-hmm. We need glass offices because there's a lot of private discussions happening. However, my office was made of glass. I sat on the same floor as everybody else. We had, I think, 5 or 6 cabins where we had our CEO, who was a Japanese gentleman, who was my joint managing director. There was me, the managing director. I had a CEO who had a small room, a CFO.
And this you're talking while your dad was in Germany?
While he was in Germany,
right.
So we made everything glass and everything was sort of transparent, everything was open. Because I believed that, we really needed to work with the people. We really needed to sort of, be one. And our culture sort of, again, goes back to Japanese culture where we eat the same food, we eat in the same canteen, we wear the same uniform. It's all very sort of standard. And that's really what sort of, drives businesses. Again, I'm a strong believer in we should not have, I would call it an aerocity office. We're in manufacturing, we should sit in the plant. So we always sit in the plants. In Munich, we sit in the plant. Here, I sit in one of our plants. We have a very lean, what we call head office or central structure. We've got me, my CEO, my CFO, my group technology officer, and the legal guy, head of legal. That's all we have. We have 5 of us. We sit in one office. And we do that because, we have to have some kind of centralized mechanism of monitoring. However, everything is run very decentralized. Each plant has their own CEOs, their own sort of teams, and they manage their own sort of, businesses. And Sona Koyo also was one company with a bunch of different joint ventures, or 2 joint ventures we had really. We had a lot of different plants, and Chennai could be a different plant. It was a different animal altogether from the north, and we had one in Gujarat. And so I spent a lot of time traveling, between the plants. I spent a lot of time with my suppliers. We had 182 suppliers in Sona Koyo, which was maybe about 180 too many, but that's how the supply chain in India. The automotive supply chain is, and that's one of the key challenges we face with a fragmented supply chain when we want to, go to 6 to 8 to 10 million vehicles. How do you consolidate this supply chain? Because there's not enough investment going into the supply chain, tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, because their businesses are so small. How do they invest in people, in machines, in equipment, in technology, etc.? So I spent a lot of time with my suppliers because I spoke a lot about quality to them. I wanted them to and I wanted the owners to be involved in the quality movement within their companies. For me, that was a big learning as well. I learned a lot from my suppliers because I spent a lot of time on their shop floors trying to understand what they did, which was unique. I always sort of went into their sort of businesses, telling them that I will make a presentation on quality. They should make a presentation on what unique practices they have, so we can sort of understand from them, and then I can walk the shop floor really from a point of giving them suggestions. I didn't want to do review meetings. I wanted to really do meetings where I could sort of add value to their business, not tell them what they're doing wrong, and then let them. And review meetings were done, but done in a different sort of forum. I spent a lot of time within each department, so I'd go from maintenance to quality to HR to sales to marketing, and just try and get the whole department together. We'd do what we call standing meetings. I'd go stand in their department, go through their workflow, what they did, again, what they did unique, where the challenges were, how we could help them. So, I spent a lot of time in sort of preparing, for the future, through a lot of these methods. That's really what gave me the confidence and the experience. And working together with the team, was really the
yeah. So now
advantage.
That you're running the business, what are the couple of things, 2-3 things that you feel that you've learned from your father that you now take forward?
So my father always taught me, even while we grew up, that the biggest the most important thing to him was integrity and reputation, right? And I always say reputation is a core value for us. Integrity is extremely important. And I think when I look at my role now, and I discuss it with you briefly in terms of an owner, what really is the role of an owner other than we meet the customer to satisfy the customer, that we're here as owners and to support the business, and this business is there for the long term. We look at joint ventures, or I look at joint ventures, and I look at acquisitions, and of course our financial investors. But compliance is a big issue. Corporate governance is a big issue. How do we make sure our companies are meeting corporate governance standards, or meeting or our compliance standards, etc. So that was something, and you could see that with my father. Had very strong boards. We had very sort of strong board members, independent directors, and the independent directors spent a lot of time with us in our business. So they would literally come every month and do reviews of our business. Really from an independent perspective. So that gave us the, sort of the mindset where you had to sort of, perform, and you had someone sort of looking over you, etc. So again, for him, reputation, integrity was of utmost importance. Quality was very, very important. He, challenged the Demi Quality Prize in 2003, I think, when we won it. Took him 5 years to get there. We were the first steering business in the world to get Demi Quality Prize. We're one of the very few companies in India that have Demi Quality, or Sona Group, or JTech is now called JTech. We at Sona BLW are now challenging the Demi Quality Prize, going down that journey. To the point where I remember once we had a quality failure, and the managing director of Toyota India came to our factory, and there was a problem with one of the workers had increased the temperature of the welding, one of the welding operations within the equipment. And I, along with the MD of Toyota India, went back and forth to the shop floor about 10 times that day, because he kept looking at the machine and coming back and making notes. Whilst we had no conversation about it while we went back and forth, for me it was the significance that people saw. The MD of their company, the MD of Toyota going back and forth, and how important quality was. What I did next was made a quality presentation to 3,500 people in groups of 10, 20, 50, whatever that means, English and Hindi. So I traveled from location to location, and I spent about 2 months just doing this. And I remember we had plants in Dharuhera, and sometimes and it was the monsoon season, it would take us 2 to 3 hours to get to the plant. But I was like, you know what, we have to do this, because I wanted to show them what the importance of quality was. So again, that really came down from my father to say that, one of the things that we will not compromise on is quality. we will not stop investing in quality even in a downturn. We may stop other costs, but we will not stop spending on quality, because quality is of utmost importance. And in our industry, creates a hygiene factor, and you can't sort of ignore it. And that's really what's kept us above or at the edge. And then today in India, frankly, in our forging business, we have a monopoly. Because A, we have a process that's superior, and B, our quality is of that nature.
And what are a couple of things that you do differently from your father?
So I feel that I'm a better delegator than he was. And again, this may also be just because of the phase that we're in our business, where I am forced to sort of run the business as an owner. He was an entrepreneur, and so he ran it in a very different style. I feel that I'm more sort of open to or more driven by growing the business, and allowing investors to come in, etc. I don't know if he would have sort of brought in a large financial investor into the business as easily as I have, because again I feel that this business, we should be able to create a large platform from this business. That's really my aim, is to create a platform from what we have. I think my father did an awesome job, and he is a legend, in his time, what he did in creating a platform for us. And it's really my role now to take this platform to the next level, And to take this to the next level, there are things that I'm going to have to do which would be very different from what my father would have done.
But that's the way of business. The inheritor takes it and then grows the business. Pleasure talking to you, Sunjay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
The Inheritors Podcast Series by Bloomberg Quint.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.